And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Neil Anderson. Neil is a freelance teacher, teacher trainer for various organizations, including International House Budapest, Euroexam International, ALS House, and the Distance Delta. He's also a co-author of the Delta publishing title, Ideas in Action, Activities for Task-Based Learning. And also Neil co-runs the blog Fluency First ALT, devoted to online task-based lessons. And today, Neil's talk is dedicated to task-based learning for online teaching. So we greet Neil with smiles in the chat. Smiles in the chat to Neil. So Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Evgeny. It's the first time I've ever been greeted by a fanfare. It's a moment I shall long treasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me 20 minutes. Having seen, many of you only having 10, I feel privileged. I think you're well aware of the fact that I use 200 words when I should probably use 2. So you've given me a bit more room here. If I may share my screen, I can. Okay, splendid. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'd like to talk about task-based learning, particularly in the context of online teaching. So task-based learning, which I'll refer to as TBL. It's also called, among other things, task-based language teaching, TBLT. Essentially, these are all the same thing, although it's a broad church with different variations. Okay, and I would like to start off with some of the basics. Now, I'm hoping in about 5 to 10 minutes to cover some of the core theory. I don't mean theory in a really theoretical way, don't panic. Just what is a task, for instance, and what is not a task. Why it might be beneficial to incorporate task-based learning in your teaching, how you might shape a lesson. And then the second half, I'd like to move on to some practical examples, and in particular, how we implement it online, myself and my colleague and co-writer, Neil McCutcheon. So, yes, I really hope to, I've got little idea how much you know about TBL or TBLT. It's been around for quite a while. It tends not to be in the center of things because course books, broadly speaking, don't follow it as a paradigm or a model. But I do want to demystify it. I don't think there's anything particularly esoteric about task-based learning. And I suspect or hope that if you consider yourself to be a communicative language teacher, that you probably do a fair proportion of it in your lessons without even thinking about it, okay? So what would it involve then? Well, a task is a classroom activity where the main focus is on meaning, not form, which is to say, if you're doing a gap fill where students have to choose between be, going to, and will, then that's not a task. It might be a perfectly valuable activity, but it wouldn't be considered to be a task, not least because another factor of a task is that the students get to choose the language they want, that they need to use in order to complete the task. So it's not about display or conformity. Here's the language I want you to use, says the teacher. It's rather the students are engaging with their own linguistic resources in order to complete a goal or some form of outcome. So this is why the activity is meaningful. There's something that the students need to do, a gap usually, that they need to somehow close. We've already seen examples of this today. For instance, when we were looking at the game in which you had to identify the spy, sure enough, it could be used for language practice, but you're still working towards something to try to solve a problem. And these are what tasks generally do. They're about the need to share information, to share experiences, to compare opinions, and to solve problems, for example. So I would like us to, just to get a feel for whether we can identify what's a task and what's not a task, I'm going to leave this sort of checklist or criteria up here, and I'll dictate to you an activity for the classroom, and you need to decide whether you consider this to be a task or not a task based upon the criteria. Okay, so I can't really see you very well. I'm looking at my running notes and at this, but perhaps if you could either give a thumbs up if you think it's a task, or just in the chat, you can write T for task or N for not a task. That is how I'd like you to respond. So for example, so here's activity number 1. The students complete sentences using be going to or will. So a gap fill. So by this criteria, is that a task or not a task? Okay. That is not a task. It doesn't fulfill the criteria. It's about using language for display. It's a controlled practice activity. Okay, here's the next one. You ready? Students agree on the 5 best items to help them survive on a desert island. Okay, I can see some thumbs up. That's a task because it involves coming to agreement. It involves bridging a gap, i.e. deciding on the 5 best items, and it's not concerned with particular language. And I chose that example to show you that this idea that tasks shouldn't be esoteric. That sort of desert island task is about as classic as you get in the business, and it's a very good example of a task. Okay. Students listen to the teacher telling a story and put pictures in order. Task or not a task? See, this one was meant to be more challenging. And that is actually a task because it's not about the students necessarily using or knowing certain language. They have to process the story meaningfully to do it. And so this makes the point that tasks aren't always about output, about speaking. They can also be about understanding as well. And if the understanding is meaningful, i.e. interpreting a text somehow, then it can be considered to be a task. And this is worth keeping in mind for lower levels in particular, where we don't necessarily want to rush learners, or we can't rush learners into speaking. Okay, a couple more. Students brainstorm what animals they want in a zoo, and then they agree where to house them, where to place them in the zoo. Task or not a task? That is a task, yeah. It's meaningful. It involves students using their own language and trying to come to agreement. Okay, here's another. Students underline all the adjectives in a text. Yeah, that's a language focus activity. It's perfectly valuable, but it's not a task as such because it's zooming in on particular forms of language. Okay, here's another one. Think about this for a few seconds. Students write 5 sentences about their house. If you're not sure, you don't have to commit to an answer, it's fine. But for me, it's not a task. There's an extent to which I haven't told the students what language to use. They're getting to create something, but for what reason? There's no clear purpose or outcome in this activity. So you could tweak it to make it task-based. I don't know what ideas you have for this. Why would we be writing sentences about our houses? Well, perhaps we want to sell it. Perhaps it's some sort of real estate task, like which house do you want to move to? If that's baked into the activity, then it becomes more meaningful and goal-oriented, and therefore, by the definition that the experts give it, task-based. Okay, last one. Students listen to each other, give a short presentation, and guess what the hobby being described is. So, I mean, one has to assume that they don't say what the hobby is at the very beginning, because that would be redundant. Yes, that is a task. So the speaker is using their own linguistic resources, and the listener has a reason to listen. They're trying to work out what the activity is. So in each of these examples that are tasks, these represent types of tasks, and there are very, very many ways to categorize tasks. The desert island survival is a listing or a ranking task. You know, the 5 most useful things. Story time, stories are tasks if they're meaningful. It's an input-based task, as I mentioned. It could also be classed as an ordering task if they have to order the pictures. The Zootopia, the zoo, is a creative task where students need to actually think through how they want their zoo to look, and also solve problems like where to position the animals. You're not supposed to put the lions next to the gazelles, for instance. And the secret hobby task is a good example of sharing personal experiences. All of these are instances of tasks, okay? And I suspect you do things like this in your lessons. So what makes it so radical? I don't think it is radical. I just think it's a richer experience on the whole. Like it's a task-based lesson can be very nutritious. It doesn't narrow down to a single language point. It gives learners motivation to share, solve, complete goals. So it really bigs up the motivation that learners need or we want them to have. It encourages them to engage with language communicatively. Yeah. It exposes them to language, plenty of samples from each other and models from the teacher, texts. And yes, we're not neglecting language. We are language teachers. So one of the beauties of task-based learning is that you can zoom in on the language that students need when they need it, when they're preparing for the task, or you can help them afterwards with the language they wanted to use but didn't quite get right. We're not obsessive about a single language point. We're obsessive about helping learners with precisely what they need, which also raises some of the difficulties of task-based learning. It's not easy to do that in practice, and that's an issue that I acknowledge. Okay, and the lessons are staged. So for the desert island task, for instance, which I was just talking about, before they even do the task, you would probably focus on brainstorming whether they think they could survive on a desert island or not. You'd want to introduce the topic. Then they would do the task where they rank and decide on things. And then afterwards, you might zoom in on language issues you've heard, problems that have occurred during the task itself. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of task-based learning in general and in very, very brief. How do we make it work online? I think you need a few things and not a lot, and certainly nothing very different from what we've seen today, and certainly nothing very different from what we use for most of our lessons. One is breakout rooms. If you're going to engage students with communication, they need to have chances to do this independently. One is some form of tool to support to scaffold the process. So that could be slides, or my preference, as with Audrey and as we've seen in the other talks today, is to use Jamboard. Yes, Jamboard, because it's also an interactive workspace, so students can do things within it. Yes, Jamboard, because it's simple. And as I like to say, if an idiot such as myself can use it, then pretty much anyone can. Its beauty is its user-friendliness. It'd be nice to have a set of ready-to-go lessons. Well, we'll come to that website in a minute. But before we do, I would like to share some practical examples on Jamboard, okay? How am I doing for time, by the way? I've totally lost track here. Okay, when am I supposed to stop?
Just let me check.
Because I won't unless you tell me to.
Actually, in 5 minutes.
Right, here we go. That's fine. We'll whiz through these, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so to share again, I've just put some of the examples we talked about to show how I might use Jamboard in different ways to facilitate the main tasks, okay? Can you all see my Jamboard? Yeah. Okay, so the first one is fairly straightforward. It's the desert island survival task, and this is a sort of basic use of Jamboard in a way. Okay, I've put up a nice picture as the background. as was mentioned earlier, you can put in an image to do that. And here we see room one. I set room one. There were two rooms in the two groups of students. Room one brainstormed their survival items. Room two brainstormed their survival items. Have a look at them. Do you think which group of survivors is going to last the longest? Any ideas?
The second.
Why do you think so?
They have whiskey.
I thought you might say because they have medicine or sun cream. But yeah, who knows? But anyway, once they brainstormed their own, and I do like brainstorming on the same page in Jamboard, I think it's valuable to do so. We move to the sort of negotiation phase where the students have to agree on 6 items altogether from both groups. And this is where they can discuss and argue with each other. And if they all agree that, you know, a tent is a valuable item, for instance, then that can go into the middle in a different color. If they all agree that a computer is useless because there's no electricity, then we can delete that. And so you whittle down the ideas until you end up with, the students end up with their 6 main items to survive in the middle. It's a very, very simple way to facilitate a communicative task using Jamboard. I mentioned stories before, and thinking of very young learners. I mean, there's some very simple tasks you can give. Use stories they're familiar with, give them a clear reason to listen in a meaningful way. Okay, so here's the story of the 3 pigs. Do I talk about all the pictures? Do I say them in the same order? You don't have to use both of those tasks, but whatever gets the students to focus meaningfully on it. And again, Jamboard is very versatile for using picture stories. And that includes, by the way, cut up picture stories. So the students can be asked to put them in order and then listen to check. I cut this up myself just using snipping tool, basically. Okay, I mentioned Zootopia. Can you all see the Zootopia slide? Again, I selected a background. I just simply searched for, well, this is a later one, but something like zoo plan, okay? And then brought up this image. And it was ideal because it has letters for the enclosures. And you can put the whole staging of a main task on a single Jamboard slide if you want. So get the students to list the animals that they want in their zoo. Here they go, they're creating their stickies. Someone turn their mic off and tell me one more animal they want to add to the zoo.
Tiger.
Okay, shining bright. Okay, so we've got tigers as well. I'll just make it a little bit smaller because it's going to be easier to move on to the map. Get the students to name their zoo. They can create a sticky note over the name. Let's call it Cool Zoo, for instance. And they've named their zoo. Okay, and then the main task, which is to decide where they're going to put the animals, and they drag them over. But it's not a good idea to have lions and gazelles next to each other. Why not? Well, because the gazelles freak out and die or whatever, and so on. So then they need to justify and come up with their arrangement for the zoo. And if you happen to have early finishers, there's plenty of stuff you can do on Jamboard as well. So if you finish early, let's delete the sticky. Okay, now here's a bonus task for those of you who were so keen that you finished early. So what other special attractions can you have in your zoo? Very, very simple. That took a very short time to prepare, essentially, but it creates the basis for a whole task for students to discuss in rooms. And just to show you, this is the secret hobby task where students have to think about their secret hobby, put up pictures in here that they find and you insert through the add image option. Some of the pictures are connected to the hobby and some are distractors. And then they present and talk through their hobbies. Now here I'm just illustrating the fact that we can see that one frame can be used for one learner. It's nice, you can put student A, student B, but if you know the names of your students, if it's not too big a group, then you can pre-prepare them in advance. It's Barlent, that's Tibor, that's Jofi, etc. You get the point. Okay, so very, very simple application of Jamboard for online tasks. More complex stuff can be found on our blog. This is a bit of a plug. but the Fluency First ELT blog, we've got 19 tasks so far. They're full lessons. They don't cost anything. They're stage, pre-task, main task, post-task, variations, language feedback. So if you might find something on here that you think is useful for your students. It has the resources you need, such as Jamboard, to support the whole process. This task, which I put up today, is about talking about your favorite movie scene, and scaffolds the process for different levels. So yeah, I'd encourage you, if you're interested to find out a bit more about task-based learning and online task-based learning, check out Fluency First ELT. It will cost you nothing except a few minutes of your time. Okay, that's it. I ran over slightly, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Neil. So a round of applause to Neil. Yeah, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
Structured, systematic, and practical talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.